The machines in Alexander Morgan's private hospital suite beeped with the cold regularity of a ticking clock, a constant reminder that his time was running out. The 68-year-old billionaire tech mogul lay propped against monogrammed pillows, surrounded by luxury that couldn't mask the smell of antiseptic and impending death. His once commanding frame had withered, and his piercing blue eyes now seemed sunken into his gaunt face. 6 months, maybe less, the specialist had told him yesterday, with that practiced sympathetic expression doctors perfect over years of delivering death sentences. The rare form of leukemia ravaging his body had proven resistant to every cutting-edge treatment his billions could buy. Alexander didn't fear death itself. He'd faced mortality during his climb from poverty to becoming one of America's wealthiest men. What haunted him was the emptiness of his legacy. Morgan Technologies employed thousands, but who would mourn the man, not the magnate? His 3 ex-wives had their settlements. His estranged son, James, hadn't spoken to him in 15 years, not since that explosive argument when the boy was just 20. Mr. Morgan, you have another stack of business proposals requiring your signature, his personal assistant Diane announced as she entered the room, her professional demeanor never wavering despite the grim circumstances. More vultures circling, Alexander muttered, waving a hand dismissively at the papers. They all know I'm dying. Everyone's securing their position for the aftermath. Diane opened her mouth to offer the obligatory denial, but the sharp ring of Alexander's private phone cut through the room. Only 5 people in the world had this number. It's not a scheduled call. Diane frowned, glancing at her tablet. Alexander motioned for the phone. Morgan, he answered, his voice still commanding despite his condition. Mr. Morgan. The voice was young, female, hesitant. My name is Emily Callahan. Alexander's expression hardened. An unknown caller on his private line was unprecedented. How did you get this number? That's complicated, the voice replied. But what matters is what I know about your condition. Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. Speak plainly or I'm hanging up. I know about the Philadelphia 3 mutation in your bone marrow. Emily's voice gained confidence. I know conventional treatments have failed, and your doctors have given you 6 months. Alexander's blood ran cold. His specific diagnosis wasn't public knowledge. He signaled for Diane to trace the call. I'm not calling to threaten you or ask for money. Emily continued quickly. I'm calling because I know how to save you. There is no cure, Alexander stated flatly. There might be, Emily replied. But to explain why I can help, I need to tell you something that will be difficult to hear. 23 years ago, you met a woman named Sarah Callahan during a tech conference in Boston. Alexander felt the room tilt slightly. Sarah Callahan, a name he hadn't heard in decades. A brief affair ended when his company went public. Sarah Callahan was my mother, Emily said quietly. And you, Mr. Morgan, are my father. The phone nearly slipped from Alexander's trembling hand. Through the shock, one thought crystallized. Was this a desperate con targeting a dying billionaire, or could this unknown young woman truly be his salvation? My name is Theo Teller, and if this introduction has already piqued your curiosity, leave your like to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. Which city are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below. This is absurd, Alexander hissed, motioning for Diane to leave the room. Once alone, he gripped the phone tighter. If this is some sort of scam, I have no reason to lie, Emily interrupted. I wouldn't have contacted you at all if circumstances weren't desperate for both of us. Alexander's analytical mind raced through possibilities. A con artist would demand money immediately. This girl was claiming biological connection, something easily disproven with a DNA test. How exactly do you propose to save my lives? He asked, his tone deliberately skeptical. I'm a perfect genetic match, Emily explained. I've inherited a rare genetic anomaly from you, a mutation that should have made me susceptible to the same condition, but my body developed a unique antibody response. My doctor believes a bone marrow transplant could work where conventional treatments have failed. Alexander had consulted the world's top specialists. None had mentioned this possibility. You expect me to believe that of all the doctors I've seen, none discovered this option, but somehow you did. They weren't looking for it, Emily replied. The Philadelphia 3 mutation is extremely rare. Without knowing you had a biological child, why would they search for compatible donors outside standard registries? Her explanation was plausible enough to give Alexander pause. He prided himself on rational decision-making, on evaluating all variables before acting. This situation demanded the same approach. Where are you? He asked. Cambridge. I'm a research assistant at MIT's biology department. Of course she would be. If she was his daughter, she would have inherited his intelligence. I'll send my private jet. You'll be in New York by evening. We'll run DNA tests immediately. I have classes tomorrow. You claimed this was a matter of life and death. Alexander cut in sharply. Was that hyperbole? A pause. No, it wasn't. Then I'll expect you this evening. After ending the call, Alexander summoned his security chief, David Chen, who entered with a concerned expression. Diane mentioned an unusual call. Is everything all right, sir? I need a complete background check on an Emily Callahan, approximately 23 years old, currently at MIT. Everything, social media, academic records, medical history if possible, and find whatever you can about Sarah Callahan from Boston, circa 2000-2001. David nodded, his expression carefully neutral. May I ask why, sir? Alexander stared out the window at Manhattan's skyline, the empire he'd built through calculated risks and unwavering determination. Now he faced perhaps the most consequential gamble of his life. She claims to be my daughter, he said quietly, and she believes she can save my life. While David worked, Alexander had his doctor brought in. Dr. Reeves listened carefully to Emily's claim about the genetic anomaly. It's theoretically possible, she admitted. The Philadelphia 3 mutation is hereditary, and there are documented cases of individuals developing natural immunity. A perfect genetic match could indeed offer treatment options we haven't considered. Hours later, as twilight settled over New York, Alexander's helicopter landed on the hospital's rooftop helipad. David entered, tablet in hand. Emily Callahan, 23, graduated summa cum laude from Stanford in biological sciences, currently pursuing her PhD at MIT, he reported. Her mother, Sarah Callahan, was indeed at the Boston Tech Summit in April 2001, where you were a keynote speaker. Sarah died of breast cancer 3 years ago. Alexander absorbed the information, a strange tightness in his chest. And does this Emily Callahan have any financial troubles? Criminal record? Suspicious associations? None, sir. Spotless record. Academic scholarships throughout her education. Published twice in peer-reviewed journals. Her social media presence is minimal but consistent with her academic profile. The elevator doors opened, and Diane appeared. Sir, Emily Callahan has arrived. Alexander straightened in his bed, suddenly aware of his weakened appearance. Send her in. When she entered, Alexander felt as though he'd been struck. The young woman before him had Sarah's delicate features, but his own ice-blue eyes stared back at him with unmistakable familiarity. She carried herself with the same controlled confidence he recognized from his own reflection decades ago. Mr. Morgan, Emily said, her voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a navy blazer over a white shirt, practical attire that still managed to look elegant. A small silver pendant hung around her neck, catching the light as she moved. Alexander gestured to the chair beside his bed. Ms. Callahan, please sit. She complied, placing a leather messenger bag carefully by her feet. The clinical surroundings contrasted with the gravity of their meeting, a first encounter between father and daughter in the shadow of mortality. I assume you've already begun investigating me, Emily said, surprising Alexander with her directness. Another trait they apparently shared. Standard procedure, he replied, studying her carefully. You made an extraordinary claim. Due diligence is necessary. I'd expect nothing less. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Did my background check satisfy your concerns? Partially. Alexander pressed a button, and Dr. Reeves entered with a medical kit. You understand we need to verify your claim genetically? Emily nodded, rolling up her sleeve. Of course. As Dr. Reeves prepared to draw blood, Alexander noticed Emily didn't flinch at the needle. Another data point. She wasn't just claiming to be his daughter. She was offering herself as a medical donor. Someone with a phobia of needles wouldn't fabricate such a scenario. Tell me about Sarah, Alexander said, his voice softer than intended. Emily's eyes flickered briefly with emotion before returning to their analytical calm. She was brilliant, a systems engineer who could solve problems no one else saw coming. She raised me alone, worked remotely so she could be present for every school event, never complained, even during her treatments. Emily paused. She never told me about you. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Then how? After she died, I found letters she'd written but never sent, and a journal. Emily met his gaze directly. She didn't keep you from me out of spite. She believed you'd made your choice. Your company was taking off, and a surprise child would have been complicated. Alexander felt an uncomfortable twist of guilt. Sarah had been different from his typical relationships, quieter, more genuine. When she'd suddenly broken things off, he'd been too consumed with Morgan Technologies' impending IPO to pursue answers. She never asked you for anything, Emily continued. And neither would I under normal circumstances, but when I was doing genetic testing for a research project, they found the same Philadelphia 3 mutation you have. The doctors were baffled when I showed no symptoms. Apparently my body produces an antibody that neutralizes the protein responsible for cell mutation. Dr. Reeves finished taking the blood samples. We'll have preliminary results within hours, full confirmation by morning. When they were alone again, Alexander studied Emily more carefully. Let's assume the DNA confirms your story. What exactly do you propose? Emily reached into her bag and retrieved a tablet. A specialized bone marrow transplant procedure. It's experimental, but the theory is sound. She pulled up medical diagrams and research papers. My bone marrow contains both the mutation and the adaptive response. Transplanted into your system, it could essentially teach your body how to fight the disease. Alexander was impressed despite himself. She presented the information with precision and clarity, anticipating his questions before he asked them. The procedure would be risky, Emily acknowledged, but your prognosis without intervention is definitive. And what do you want in return? Alexander asked bluntly. Money? Recognition? A place in my will? Emily's expression hardened, and in that moment, she looked so much like him that it was startling. I want to save a life I have the unique ability to save, she said coldly. That's it. After the procedure, you'll never have to see me again, if that's your preference. Alexander had built his empire by reading people, identifying their true motivations beneath polished veneers. Emily's sincerity was either genuine, or she was the most accomplished liar he'd ever encountered. Before Alexander could respond, Dr. Reeves returned with a tablet in hand, her expression carefully neutral. The preliminary results are in, she announced. Alexander and Emily both turned toward her, the tension in the room palpable. It's a match, Dr. Reeves confirmed. 98% probability of paternity. And more importantly, Emily does indeed carry the Philadelphia 3 mutation with an unprecedented antibody response. For a moment, neither Alexander nor Emily spoke. The scientific confirmation of their biological connection hung between them, an invisible thread suddenly made tangible. I'd like a moment alone with Ms. Callahan, Alexander finally said, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake shifting his reality. When the doctor left, Alexander studied Emily's face with new awareness. How had he not seen it immediately? The determined set of her jaw, the analytical gleam in her eyes. These were traits he recognized from his own reflection. "Why didn't Sarah ever tell me?" he asked, the question emerging more vulnerable than he intended. Emily's expression softened slightly. She said in her journal that she discovered she was pregnant just as Morgan Technologies was preparing to go public. Your face was suddenly in every tech magazine, profiled as the industry's rising star. She hesitated. She wrote that she called your office once, but your assistant said you were unavailable for weeks. She took it as a sign. Alexander remembered those chaotic months, sleeping in his office, barely eating as he navigated the IPO. How many other important things had he missed while building his empire? "And you?" he asked. "You grew up without ever knowing who your father was?" "Mom always said my father was someone important who couldn't be part of our lives." Emily smiled faintly. "I imagined you were a spy or an astronaut when I was little." The unexpected glimpse into her childhood struck Alexander deeply. A daughter. He had a daughter who had imagined him as a hero. "The reality must have been disappointing," he said dryly. "Finding out my father is Alexander Morgan was surprising," Emily admitted, "but discovering I might have inherited something that could save your lives, that feels like purpose, not disappointment." Her words lacked the bitter resentment he might have expected. Instead, there was a pragmatic acceptance that reminded him of himself. "I've reviewed your proposed treatment," Alexander said, refocusing. "Dr. Reeves believes it has merit, but we'll need to consult specialists." Emily nodded. "I brought my complete medical history and research materials. The procedure would need to begin with preparing your system. It's not without risks." "I'm already dying," Alexander replied bluntly. "A risk is relative." For the first time, Emily smiled fully, a brilliant expression that transformed her face. "Another trait we share, apparently." Alexander found himself smiling back, the gesture unfamiliar after months of grimness. Then his business mind reasserted itself, analyzing the situation from all angles. "Where will you stay while we consult specialists?" "I booked a hotel." "Nonsense. You'll stay in my guest suite. It's within the secure hospital wing but offers privacy." Emily appeared ready to object, then reconsidered. "That would be more convenient for the medical consultations." As Alexander reached for the call button to make arrangements, his phone chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen and froze. The message was from his son, James. "Just heard about your condition. I'm flying in tomorrow. We need to talk." Alexander stared at the screen, then at Emily. For 15 years, his son had maintained radio silence, refusing all attempts at reconciliation. Now, as he faced death, both of his children had suddenly appeared in his life. "Is something wrong?" Emily asked, noticing his expression. Alexander hesitated, then made a decision. "My son, your half-brother, is coming tomorrow. He doesn't know about you." Emily's eyes widened slightly, the news of a sibling clearly unexpected. "I didn't realize you had other children." "Just James. We haven't spoken in 15 years. Alexander's voice grew distant. He wanted to pursue humanitarian architecture instead of joining Morgan Technologies. I told him he was throwing away his birthright, his responsibility. Words were said that couldn't be unsaid. "And now he's coming," Emily observed quietly. "Because I'm dying," Alexander confirmed, a bitter edge to his voice. Nothing like impending death to prompt reconciliation. Stories like this remind us about the power of second chances and unexpected connections that can heal old wounds. If you believe in life's surprising turns, consider subscribing to witness more journeys like this one unfold. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Alexander woke to find Emily already in his hospital suite, reviewing medical charts with Dr. Reeves and two new specialists. They'd been up all night analyzing her proposal, exchanging rapid-fire medical terminology that even Alexander, with his technical background, struggled to follow. "The protocol is unorthodox but theoretically sound," said an older doctor with a German accent, Dr. Weber, a hematology specialist Alexander had flown in from Munich. "Theoretically being the operative word," countered the younger doctor, Dr. Patel, a cellular regeneration expert from Johns Hopkins. "We have no case studies, no precedent." Emily pointed to a sequence on her tablet. "My antibodies have consistently neutralized the Philadelphia 3 protein in vitro. The transplant should enable Mr. Morgan's system to produce these antibodies independently." "At significant risk," Dr. Patel emphasized. "The rejection potential alone." "I've calculated the risk factors," Emily interrupted, bringing up a complex probability matrix. "Considering Mr. Morgan's prognosis without intervention, even a 30% success rate represents significant improvement." Alexander watched Emily defend her proposal with fierce intelligence, standing her ground against doctors twice her age. Pride, an emotion he hadn't anticipated, swelled unexpectedly in his chest. "If I might interrupt," Alexander said, causing all heads to turn, "I'd like a summary of where we stand." Dr. Reeves stepped forward. "Emily's proposal is medically sound, if unprecedented. We've spent the night developing a treatment protocol that would begin with targeted radiation to prepare your system, followed by a specialized bone marrow transplant. The procedure would be conducted in 3 phases over 2 weeks. And my chances?" The doctors exchanged glances before Dr. Weber spoke. "Without this treatment, your prognosis remains 6 months. With it, perhaps a 40% chance of remission. When can we begin?" "Alexander," Dr. Reeves cautioned, "there are serious considerations. The treatment will be grueling. You'll become much sicker before there's any possibility of improvement. And if it fails, I'll die a few months sooner than expected," Alexander finished for her. "But if it succeeds—" The conversation halted as Diane appeared in the doorway, her professional composure showing rare cracks of anxiety. "Mr. Morgan, your son has arrived." Alexander hadn't expected James until afternoon. This early arrival was tactical. James had always been strategic, despite rejecting the business world. "Give me a moment with the doctors," Alexander requested. Diane nodded and retreated. Once alone with the medical team, Alexander made his decision. "Prepare everything for the procedure. I want to begin as soon as possible." "We should run additional compatibility tests," Dr. Patel insisted. "Do them alongside the preliminary treatments," Alexander countered. "Time is the one resource I cannot replace." As the doctors filed out to make preparations, Alexander caught Emily's arm gently. "Stay, please. I'd like you to meet James." Surprise flickered across her face. "Are you sure that's wise? He's coming to reconcile with his father, not discover a secret half-sister." Alexander considered this. "James deserves to know the truth, all of it." When James entered moments later, the resemblance between father and son was immediately apparent. Though James wore his wealth differently, casually dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, his expression guarded but determined. At 42, James had built his own reputation designing sustainable housing projects in developing countries. His work had won awards Alexander had privately followed but never acknowledged. "Dad," James said simply, the word carrying 15 years of complicated history. "James." Alexander nodded, then gestured to Emily. "This is Emily Callahan. She's my daughter, your half-sister." James froze, his eyes darting between them in shock. "What?" "I just learned of her existence myself," Alexander explained. "It's a recent development." Emily stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you, James. I understand this is unexpected." James didn't take her hand, his expression hardening as he turned to his father. 15 years of silence, and now that you're dying, you produce a secret daughter. Is this some kind of twisted attempt to replace me? James, Alexander started, how convenient that she appears just as your fortune needs an heir, James continued bitterly. Emily's face flushed. I'm not here for his money. I'm a genetic match for a treatment that might save his life. Of course you are, James said sarcastically, the perfect daughter swooping in to save the day when the disappointing son failed to live up to expectations. Alexander's temper flared. That's enough. Emily isn't responsible for our history, and she deserves better than your unfounded accusations. The room fell silent, the three of them forming a dysfunctional triangle of newly discovered family. Emily looked between them, visibly uncomfortable at being the catalyst for reopening old wounds. Perhaps I should give you two some privacy, she suggested, backing toward the door. No, both men said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise at the moment of synchronicity. Alexander gestured toward the sitting area of the suite. Let's all sit down. There's much to discuss, and theatrical confrontations waste energy I can't afford to spare. Reluctantly, James took a seat across from his father, while Emily perched uncomfortably on a chair between them. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. I think I deserve some explanation, James said, breaking the silence. A half-sister appears out of nowhere, claiming she can miraculously save your life. It's not a miracle, Emily corrected, her scientific precision asserting itself. It's a genetic anomaly with medical application. James studied her with narrowed eyes. And how did you discover this connection? Genetic testing services? I found letters after my mother died, Emily explained. She never told me who my father was while she was alive. How convenient, James muttered. Alexander leaned forward. I've verified everything, James. The DNA confirms she's my daughter, and more importantly, she carries a genetic antibody response that might counteract my condition. So you're going through with an experimental procedure based on the word of someone who appeared in your life 3 days ago, James demanded incredulously. Based on the recommendation of 4 specialists who've reviewed her research, Alexander corrected sharply. Your concern is noted, but uninformed. Emily watched their exchange, her analytical mind clearly processing the complex family dynamics unfolding before her. Finally, she spoke up. James, I understand your skepticism. In your position, I would feel the same. Her tone was measured without defensiveness. I didn't come here expecting anything from your father beyond the chance to help. I have my own life, my own career. I don't need or want his fortune. James seemed taken aback by her directness. Why would you help him? He wasn't there for you growing up. That wasn't his choice, Emily responded. My mother never told him about me. Alexander felt a twist of guilt, though I gave her every reason to believe I wouldn't welcome the news. This admission of fault, rare from Alexander Morgan, caused both of his children to look at him with surprise. I was driven, Alexander continued, the words emerging with difficulty. Building Morgan Technologies consumed me. I missed so much. James's expression flickered with something complex, perhaps recognition of the closest thing to an apology his father had ever offered. The moment was interrupted when Dr. Reeves entered with a tablet. Mr. Morgan, we've arranged the treatment schedule. The preparatory radiation would begin tomorrow morning if you're ready to proceed. Alexander nodded decisively. I am. Dad, James interjected, at least take some time to consider other options. There are no other options, Alexander stated flatly. My condition is terminal, without intervention. James turned to Dr. Reeves. And this procedure? What are the risks? Significant, she admitted. The radiation will severely compromise his immune system. The transplant itself carries risks of rejection, and even if technically successful, his body might not respond as we hope. Then why do it? James demanded. Because it's my only chance, Alexander answered before Dr. Reeves could respond. A chance I wouldn't have without Emily. Emily had remained silent during this exchange, but now she spoke directly to James. Would you be willing to review the medical protocol yourself? You clearly care about your father's well-being. I'd welcome another perspective. The gesture, opening her research to his scrutiny rather than dismissing his concerns, seemed to catch James off guard. I'm not a doctor, he said, less hostility in his voice, but you're intelligent and have his best interests at heart, Emily countered. Sometimes fresh eyes see what specialists miss. Alexander watched this exchange with growing fascination. Emily was navigating the emotional minefield with remarkable skill, neither apologizing for her existence nor antagonizing James. Fine, James finally agreed. I'd like to see the research. As Dr. Reeves left to retrieve additional materials, Alexander made a decision. Emily, James, I need to speak with both of you about practical matters. Dad, this isn't the time to discuss inheritance, James objected. On the contrary, Alexander replied, with a potentially life-threatening procedure ahead, it's precisely the time. He pressed the call button for his lawyer, who had been waiting nearby. When Walter Chen, his longtime legal counsel, entered with a briefcase, Alexander gestured for him to set up at the small conference table. I've prepared a revised estate plan, Alexander explained as Walter arranged documents. Regardless of whether this treatment succeeds, certain matters should be settled. Emily stood suddenly. I should leave for this discussion. I've already told you I don't want. Sit down, Emily, Alexander said, not unkindly, but with the natural authority that had built his empire. To his mild surprise, she complied. Morgan Technologies has grown beyond what any single person should control, Alexander continued. I've restructured the company's governance and my personal holdings. Walter distributed folders to both James and Emily. James, I've established a foundation for sustainable architecture and development in your name with a $5 billion endowment, Alexander stated, watching his son's eyes widen in shock. Your work deserves proper funding, regardless of our personal differences. Before James could respond, Alexander turned to Emily. Emily, I've created a medical research institute focused on genetic therapies, with you as head researcher if you choose to accept. It's endowed separately from Morgan Technologies. Emily began to protest, but Alexander raised his hand. This isn't charity or guilt money. It's investment in work that matters. You've both chosen paths of purpose rather than profit. I'm simply providing resources. The siblings sat in stunned silence, neither having expected this outcome. The morning of the procedure arrived with a weak winter sun, struggling through the Manhattan skyscrapers. Alexander sat propped in his hospital bed, watching the city he'd conquered from his penthouse suite. The medical team had transformed the adjoining rooms into a specialized treatment center, with equipment flown in from research facilities around the world. We should begin the preparatory protocol in 30 minutes, Dr. Reeves announced, entering with a team of specialists. Alexander nodded, his gaze still fixed on the cityscape. 3 weeks ago, he'd been resigning himself to death. Now, improbably, he faced the possibility of survival, through the intervention of a daughter he hadn't known existed. Is Emily ready? He asked. Being prepped now, Dr. Weber confirmed. Her initial harvest went perfectly. The door opened again, and James entered, looking exhausted. He'd spent the past 2 days relentlessly reviewing Emily's research and the treatment protocol, questioning every specialist, scrutinizing every data point. You look terrible, Alexander commented, earning a wry smile from his son. I've been up all night, James admitted, taking a seat beside the bed. running through the research again. And? James hesitated. It's sound. Unorthodox, but sound. Emily's theory has merit. Alexander heard the unspoken concern. But you still have reservations. Not about the science, James clarified, leaning forward. About what happens if it works. Alexander raised an eyebrow, waiting for his son to continue. You spent your life pursuing immortality through Morgan Technologies, James said carefully. If Emily saves your life, if you get a second chance, what will you do with it? Return to 60-hour work weeks building an empire that's already more than enough? The question struck Alexander with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on survival that he hadn't considered what survival would mean. I don't know, he admitted, the rare confession of uncertainty hanging between them. James seemed surprised by the honesty. Well, that's something at least. He paused, then added, I've been thinking about Emily's foundation proposal. And? Alexander prompted. I'd like to work with her, James said. Combine our foundations. My sustainable architecture with her genetic research could create something remarkable. Housing that adapts to genetic health factors in different populations. Alexander blinked in surprise. You've discussed this with her? Last night, James confirmed. She's brilliant, Dad. Reminds me of you, actually. The way you were before Morgan Technologies consumed everything. Before Alexander could respond, Emily herself appeared in the doorway, dressed in a hospital gown, her hair covered in a surgical cap. Despite the clinical attire, she carried herself with composed dignity. They're ready for us, she announced. Alexander studied his two children, the son he'd driven away, and the daughter he'd never known. Both brilliant in their own ways, both carrying pieces of himself he recognized. I'd like a moment alone with Emily, he requested. James nodded, squeezing his father's shoulder briefly before leaving. When they were alone, Emily approached the bed. Nervous? She asked. I don't do nervous, Alexander replied automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, yes. Not about dying. I've made my peace with that possibility. I'm nervous about living. Emily tilted her head questioningly. If this works, Alexander explained, I'll owe my life to someone I didn't know existed a week ago. It's humbling. Science doesn't care about humility, Emily said with the ghost of a smile. The antibodies will work, or they won't, regardless of our relationship. Is that how you see it, just science? Emily considered this carefully. No, she finally admitted. When I found my mother's letters and learned who you were, I was angry at first. I imagined confronting you, demanding explanations. What changed? I learned about your diagnosis from a medical database I was researching. Suddenly my anger seemed irrelevant compared to the possibility that I might save your life. She paused. Mom always said everything happens for a reason. Perhaps this is why I have this genetic anomaly. Alexander, who had built his life on strategic calculation rather than fate, found himself strangely moved by her perspective. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice more hesitant than Emily had yet heard it. Something I haven't told James or the doctors. Emily moved closer, concern crossing her features. The radiation treatment will likely work as planned, Alexander continued, but the final phase has only a 30% chance of success, not the 40% they've quoted. Emily's eyes widened. You've seen the additional data? Alexander nodded. I had an independent analysis done. The treatment will be more difficult than they're admitting, and my age compounds the risk factors. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to promise me something, Alexander said, reaching for her hand. If this fails, if it becomes clear the treatment isn't working, I want you to stop it. Let me go. Emily shook her head. I can't make that decision. The doctors... The doctors will try everything until the bitter end, Alexander interrupted. It's their job. But I've lived long enough to know when to cut my losses. He tightened his grip on her hand. Promise me you'll know when to stop. Emily stared at him, conflict evident in her expression. The scientist weighing probabilities against the daughter facing her father's mortality. Only if it's truly hopeless, she finally agreed, not a moment before. Alexander nodded, satisfied. One more thing. If I don't survive this, look after James. He'll pretend he doesn't need anyone, but he does. He's 42, Emily pointed out with a small smile, and seems perfectly capable. Age doesn't matter. He's still my son, and now your brother. These words, the simple acknowledgement of their family connection, visibly affected Emily. For a brief moment, her scientific composure cracked, revealing the young woman who'd grown up without a father. A nurse appeared in the doorway. It's time, Mr. Morgan. Endorsed him as they wheeled him toward the treatment room. Alexander noticed James waiting in the hallway. His son fell into step beside the gurney, while Emily walked on the other side. For a moment, perhaps his last conscious moment as the same man he'd always been, Alexander Morgan was flanked by both his children, a family configuration he'd never imagined possible. The treatment room hummed with the sterile efficiency of advanced medical technology. Alexander lay perfectly still as radiation targeted his bone marrow with microscopic precision, the first phase of a process designed to prepare his body for Emily's cells. The procedure itself was silent and invisible. The true battle would happen at the cellular level, beyond human perception. Vitals are stable, Dr. Reeves announced, her eyes fixed on the monitoring equipment. First phase progressing as expected. James stood by the observation window, watching his father with an intensity that betrayed his concern despite their complicated history. Emily sat nearby, reviewing real-time cellular data streaming to her tablet, occasionally conferring with Dr. Weber in hushed tones. Hours passed in this sterile limbo. By evening, the first phase was complete, leaving Alexander exhausted but conscious. We'll begin the transplant tomorrow morning, Dr. Patel explained as they moved Alexander back to his suite. Your body needs time to process the radiation treatment. That night, as a storm gathered over Manhattan, the anticipated side effects struck with brutal force. Alexander's temperature spiked dangerously, his body rebelling against the treatment meant to save it. His consciousness wavered between clarity and confusion as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize him. Through the haze of fever, he was vaguely aware of Emily and James taking shifts by his bedside. Once, when the fever briefly broke, he opened his eyes to find Emily asleep in the chair beside him, her hand resting near his on the bed. The sight of her, this daughter who was still essentially a stranger, yet bound to him by blood and now by this desperate medical gamble, stirred something protective in him. She's been here all night, James said quietly from the other side of the bed. Refused to leave, even when the nurses suggested it. Alexander turned to his son, surprised to find him still present. You're still here too? James shrugged, the gesture attempting casualness, but failing to hide his concern. Someone needs to make sure you don't bully the medical staff. It was as close to affection as they had come in 15 years. Alexander felt a wave of regret for the time lost, for the father he hadn't been. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice raspy from the treatment. About your work. I followed it, you know. The sustainable housing projects in Rwanda, the flood-resistant communities in Bangladesh. James looked startled by the confession. You kept track of my career? Every project, Alexander confirmed. I have a file. For a moment, James seemed at a loss for words. Then, why didn't you ever say anything? Pride, Alexander answered simply. Stubbornness. Fear that you'd reject any overture. He paused, gathering strength. All the qualities that made me successful in business made me fail as a father. James stared out the window at the storm lashing against the glass. I wasn't blameless. I could have reached out too. A soft voice interrupted them. You both have the same expression when you're thinking. Emily had awakened and was watching them with tired eyes. It's uncanny. The observation, simple yet intimate, highlighted the strange reality they now inhabited. A family formed in crisis, discovering connections even as they faced the possibility of loss. Morning brought new challenges. Alexander's blood work showed concerning patterns, his body struggling more than anticipated with the pre-transplant protocol. We need to decide whether to proceed with the transplant or delay, Dr. Reeves explained to Emily and James in the consultation room while Alexander rested. His system is under significant stress. Delaying could mean losing our window of opportunity, Dr. Weber countered. The radiation treatment has a limited, effective period. Emily studied the data with clinical detachment. What does the cellular response indicate? Mixed signals, Dr. Patel admitted. Some markers suggest readiness, others indicate potential rejection. James looked between the specialists. In simple terms, what happens if we proceed and you're wrong? Multi-system organ failure, Dr. Reeves answered bluntly, but waiting carries its own risks. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the room. Emily closed her eyes briefly, seeming to center herself, then looked at James. It should be a family decision. James nodded, understanding the significance of her inclusion of him in this moment. Together, they returned to Alexander's room, where he lay awake, his normally commanding presence diminished, but his gaze still sharp. They've told you the situation, he stated rather than asked, reading their expressions. Emily nodded. We need to decide whether to proceed today or wait. And what do my children recommend? Alexander asked. The phrase, my children, deliberate. James and Emily exchanged glances before Emily spoke. The science suggests proceeding. Despite the elevated risk, your condition is deteriorating faster than anticipated. Waiting may eliminate any chance of success. James, Alexander turned to his son. James took a deep breath. I agree with Emily. The window is closing. It's now or never. Alexander studied them both. These two brilliant people who carried his DNA, yet had become so much more than extensions of himself. In their different ways, both had surpassed him. James with his humanitarian vision, Emily with her scientific brilliance. Then we proceed, he decided, but I want both of you to step back from the process. What? Emily protested. I need to be involved in monitoring the cellular response. You can observe, Alexander conceded, but from a distance. The specialists will handle the procedure. Why? James demanded. Alexander's expression softened slightly. Because regardless of the outcome, you two are the most important legacy I'll leave behind. I won't have you carrying the burden if this fails. Dad, James began. This isn't negotiable, Alexander interrupted, a flash of his corporate authority returning. I've spent my life controlling every variable, planning for every contingency. This may be the one situation I can't control, and I need to accept that. As the medical team prepared for the transplant, Alexander requested a brief private moment with his lawyer. When Walter arrived, Alexander dictated one final amendment to his arrangements, a provision neither James nor Emily would learn about until later. By noon, everything was ready. Emily's harvested cells, containing the critical antibodies, were prepared for transplant. The procedure itself was anticlimactic, a specialized IV drip that looked no different from any other medical treatment. The true drama would unfold invisibly, as Emily's cells either saved Alexander's life or failed to overcome the aggressive disease. Days blurred together in a haze of pain and disorientation as Alexander's body battled itself. The transplanted cells launched their microscopic war against the disease, while his weakened immune system struggled to accept this foreign salvation. For the observers, the doctors, James and Emily, the waiting was excruciating, marked only by the clinical data streaming from monitoring equipment and regular blood tests that told an evolving story. On the third day post-transplant, Alexander's fever spiked to dangerous levels. His systems began to fail, one by one, as the doctors had warned might happen. "We're losing him," Dr. Reeves announced grimly, as alarms blared and medical staff rushed into action. "The rejection is accelerating." Emily stood frozen at the observation window, her scientific mind processing the data, even as her newly discovered emotions struggled to reconcile with the sight of her father fighting for his life. "There must be something we can try," she insisted, turning to Dr. Weber. "An additional immunosuppressant cocktail, perhaps, something to give the cells more time to integrate." "We've pushed the boundaries of established protocol already," Dr. Weber replied, the weariness in his voice suggesting he'd exhausted all options, or any more intervention could kill him outright. James appeared beside Emily, his face haggard from sleepless nights. "Oh, what does your instinct tell you?" he asked her quietly, not as a scientist, as his daughter. Emily closed her eyes, centering herself. When she opened them, there was a new resolve in her expression. "We need to let his body fight," she said with sudden clarity. "We're overriding his natural responses with too many interventions." "That contradicts standard procedure," Dr. Patel objected. "Standard procedures aren't working," Emily countered. "Look at the cellular markers. His system is fighting both the disease and our interventions. We need to scale back. Let his body recognize my cells as allies, not enemies." The medical team exchanged skeptical glances, but Alexander's deteriorating condition demanded action, or in this case, deliberate inaction. "Reduce immunosuppressants by 30%, Dr. Reeves finally ordered. "Maintain life support, but scale back intervention to essential systems only." The next 24 hours were the darkest yet. Alexander's condition continued to decline, his vital signs weakening as his body fought its internal battle without the full array of medical assistance. Emily and James maintained their vigil, barely speaking, connected in their shared fear and desperate hope. During that long night, as rain lashed against the hospital windows, James finally broke the silence. "He told me about your agreement, that you promised to know when to let him go." Emily looked up sharply. "You think it's time?" James ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know. That's what terrifies me. For 15 years, I told myself I hated him for trying to control my life. Now I'd give anything for him to wake up and start ordering us all around again." A ghost of a smile touched Emily's lips. "I've only known him a week, but I can imagine that clearly." "He's the most infuriating, brilliant, stubborn man I've ever known," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "And beneath all that, he has this capacity for vision that's almost prophetic. He sees potential others miss." "He saw it in you," Emily observed. "Even when you thought he didn't, he followed your career." James nodded. "And somehow, he saw something in you worth trusting with his life after meeting you once." They fell silent again, watching Alexander's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, his powerful presence reduced to data points on blinking monitors. As dawn broke, Dr. Reeves entered with the latest test results, her expression unreadable. "There's been a change," she announced. Emily and James tensed, prepared for the worst. "The antibody markers are showing increased activity," the doctor continued, a note of cautious hope entering her voice. "And the Philadelphia 3 proteins are showing first signs of degradation." Emily grabbed the tablet, scanning the results with growing excitement. The treatment is working, she breathed. Scaling back the interventions allowed his system to synchronize with the transplanted cells. It's very preliminary, Dr. Reeves cautioned. He's still critically ill, but over the next 48 hours, the tentative improvements solidified. Alexander's fever began to subside. His vital signs stabilized, then strengthened. The aggressive cancer cells that had been multiplying unchecked began to retreat under the assault from Emily's donated antibodies. On the 7th day after the transplant, Alexander opened his eyes fully for the first time, his gaze clear and focused as it settled on his children, who had fallen asleep in chairs on either side of his bed. "You both look terrible," he rasped, his voice weak but unmistakably his own. James and Emily jolted awake simultaneously. "Dad!" James leaned forward, scarcely believing what he was seeing. Alexander's lips curved in a faint smile. "Were you expecting someone else?" Emily quickly pressed the call button for the medical team, her scientific composure momentarily overwhelmed by emotion as she grasped Alexander's hand. "The treatment is working," she told him. "Your latest scans show a 40% reduction in cancer cells." "I knew it would," Alexander replied with characteristic confidence, though the effect was somewhat undermined by his weakened state. "Morgan men don't surrender easily. And Callahan women are apparently just as stubborn," Emily countered with a watery smile. "It was touch and go for a while. We nearly lost you." "But you didn't," Alexander said, his gaze moving between his children, "because you worked together." As the doctors rushed in to assess their patient's remarkable recovery, James stepped back to let them work, pulling Emily aside. "He's going to make it, isn't he?" he asked, still sounding disbelieving. Emily nodded, the scientist in her cautiously resurfacing. "The prognosis is encouraging. It's not a complete cure. He'll need ongoing treatment and monitoring, but the immediate crisis has passed." "So, what happens now?" James asked, the question encompassing far more than medical procedures. Emily understood the broader implications. "Now we figure out how to be a family, I suppose. Something none of us expected a week ago." They both looked at Alexander, who was already arguing with Dr. Reeves about his recovery timeline, insisting he could resume limited work within days rather than weeks. "Some things never change," James observed with a mix of exasperation and fondness. "He'll be trying to run board meetings from his hospital bed by tomorrow, unless we give him something more important to focus on," Emily suggested thoughtfully. 6 months later, Alexander Morgan stood at the edge of a vast construction site on the outskirts of Boston, watching as workers laid the foundation for what would become the Morgan Callahan Institute for Genetic Research and Sustainable Development. The spring sun warmed his face, a sensation he had once taken for granted, but now savored with the appreciation of someone who had stared death in the face. "The solar array should be completed by winter," James explained, unrolling architectural plans on a portable table. "The entire complex will generate more energy than it consumes, feeding the excess back to surrounding communities." "And the laboratory wing?" Alexander asked, turning to Emily, who stood examining soil samples with a researcher. Emily joined them, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "State of the art. We've already assembled research teams focused on translating my antibody research to other genetic conditions. The first clinical trials should begin by next year." Alexander nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Though still thinner than his pre-illness days, he had regained much of his strength. Weekly treatments continued to keep the cancer at bay, and while the doctors hesitated to use the word cured, his prognosis had improved beyond anyone's initial hopes. "Walk with me," he said to his children, moving toward a hilltop overlooking the construction site. As they climbed, Alexander felt a twinge in his side, a reminder of his mortality that the old Alexander would have ignored or denied. Now, he simply slowed his pace slightly, allowing his children to match his steps. Another change. The Alexander Morgan of a year ago would have seen any physical limitation as weakness. The man he had become recognized the wisdom in adaptation. At the summit, they paused to take in the panoramic view. The Institute sprawled beneath them, one part of a vastly different legacy than Alexander had once envisioned. Morgan Technologies continued to thrive under the leadership team he had assembled, but it no longer dominated his daily thoughts or defined his worth. "I've been thinking," Alexander said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "about adding a residential component to the Institute." James raised an eyebrow. "What kind of residential component?" "Living quarters for families of patients undergoing experimental treatments," Alexander explained. "Not everyone can afford extended stays in Boston." Emily smiled, recognizing the source of this idea. During her mother's cancer treatments, they had struggled with housing costs while seeking specialized care away from home. "That's a significant expansion of the original plan," James noted, already mentally calculating the additional costs and space requirements. "I think we can handle it," Alexander replied, a hint of his old, confident manner surfacing. "Between your design expertise and Emily's research focus, we're uniquely positioned to create something revolutionary, healthcare and housing integrated through a genetic environmental approach." James and Emily exchanged knowing glances. Over the past months, they had grown accustomed to their father's evolving vision for the Institute, each new idea more ambitious than the last. His near-death experience hadn't diminished his drive, it had merely redirected it from pure profit to purpose. "Speaking of family," Emily said, checking her watch, "we should head back. Sarah's flight lands in 2 hours." Alexander nodded, trying not to appear overly eager. Sarah Matthews, a marine biologist James had been dating for several years, was flying in for her first extended visit. The old Alexander would have viewed any potential daughter-in-law with suspicious scrutiny. The new Alexander was simply grateful for another chance to know the people important to his son's life. As they descended toward the waiting car, Alexander's phone chimed with a message from Diane, who still managed his reduced schedule with characteristic efficiency. "The board approved your sabbatical," he announced. 6 months, starting in July." "Sabbatical?" Emily questioned. "You never mentioned that." "It's a recent decision," Alexander admitted. "I'm joining a fellowship program at Stanford, guest lecturing for the business school while learning about emerging biotech applications. Thought I might audit some of the advanced genetics courses as well." James stopped walking, staring at his father in frank amazement. "You're going back to school? At 68? 69 next month," Alexander corrected with a small smile. "And why not? Thanks to Emily, I have time I never expected to have. Seems foolish to waste it doing only what I already know how to do." Emily appeared equally stunned. "But Stanford is across the country. What about your treatments?" "Already arranged with specialists there," Alexander assured her. "Besides, I expect both of you to visit. The house I've rented has plenty of room." As they reached the car, Alexander paused to look back at the Institute taking shape on the hillside. A year ago, his legacy was to be Morgan Technologies, a corporate empire built through relentless drive and often at the expense of personal connections. Now his true legacy stood beside him, his children, and through them, this institute that would carry forward both their names and their complementary visions. That evening, after a dinner that would have once seemed impossibly domestic, James and Sarah discussing her research, Emily explaining her latest findings to an attentive Alexander, they gathered on the terrace of Alexander's Boston apartment. "A toast," Alexander proposed, raising his glass of sparkling water, another concession to his ongoing recovery. "To unexpected beginnings." "To family," James added, his arm around Sarah's waist. "To second chances," Emily concluded, completing the sentiment. As conversation flowed easily among them, Alexander found himself watching rather than participating, struck by the simple miracle of their presence. His body might still bear the scars of his illness, might still require treatment to keep the remaining cancer cells at bay, but in all the ways that mattered, he had never been healthier. A random phone call from an unknown daughter had not only saved his life in the medical sense, but had given him something his wealth and power never could: the chance to remake himself, to become the father his children deserved, to find purpose beyond prosperity. As the evening drew to a close, Emily pulled Alexander aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, Alexander found a leather-bound journal. Opening it, he recognized Sarah Callahan's handwriting, the same flowing script from the letters Emily had shown him months earlier. "It's my mother's journal from when she was expecting me," Emily explained softly. "I thought you might want to know that part of the story." Alexander ran his fingers over the pages, feeling a complex mixture of regret for what he had missed and gratitude for this unexpected bridge to the past. "Thank you," he said simply, words inadequate for the gift she had given him, both in this moment and when she had saved his life. "We can't change the past," Emily said, echoing thoughts similar to his own. "But it turns out the future is surprisingly flexible." Alexander Morgan, who had built an empire by predicting market trends and technological evolutions, found himself embracing the one future he had never anticipated: a life defined not by acquisition or achievement, but by connection, contribution, and the humble recognition that his greatest legacy was not what he had built, but who he had helped become. My name is Theo Teller, and I want to thank you for joining me on this extraordinary journey. If this story touched your heart or made you reflect on your own family connections, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your comments mean the world to us. Share your thoughts on Alexander's transformation or suggest themes you'd like to see in future stories. Until next time, remember that sometimes life's most profound second chances arrive in ways we never expected.